Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Happy to be back with you again. And we're continuing to read in our story, Little House on the Prairie. So yesterday, they built two stout doors, one for the house and one for the stable. So they'll all be safe if the wolves come back. Let's see what they're going to do today. This is a good hint. A fire on the hearth. And here is the picture that they have. Outside the house, close to the log wall opposite the door, Pa cut away the grass and scraped the ground smooth. He was getting ready to build the firebox. Then he and Ma put the wagon box on the wheels again, and Pa hitched up Pet and Patty. The rising sun was shortening all the shadows. Hundreds of meadowlarks were rising from the prairie, singing higher and higher in the air. That's what that little bird in the grass was. Their songs came down from the great clear skies like a rain of music. And all over the land, where the grasses waved and murmured in the wind, thousands of little dicky birds clung with their tiny claws to the blooming weeds and sang their thousands of little songs. Pet and Patty sniffed the air and whinnied with joy. They arched their necks and pawed at the ground because they were eager to go. Pa was whistling while he climbed into the wagon seat and took up the reins. Then he looked at Laura, who was looking up at him, and stopped whistling and said, "Want to go along, Laura? You and Mary?" Ma said they could. They climbed up the wheels, clinging to the spokes with their bare toes, and they sat on the high wagon seat beside Pa. Pet and Patty started with a little jump, and the wagon went jolting down the road that Pa's wagon wheels had made. They went down between the bare reddish-yellow walls of the earth, all ridged and wrinkled by forgotten rains. Then they went on across the rolling land of the creek bottoms. Masses of trees covered the low, rounded hills, and some of them were grassy, open spaces. Deer were lying in the shadows of the trees, and the deer were grazing in the sunshine on the green grass. They lifted their heads and pricked their ears and stood chewing and watching the wagon with their large, soft eyes. All along the road, the wild larkspur, it's a flower, was blooming pink and blue and white. Birds bounced on the yellow plumes of goldenrod, and butterflies were fluttering. Starry daisies lighted the shadows under the trees. Squirrels chattered on the branches overhead. White-tailed rabbits hopped along the road, and snakes wiggled quickly across when they heard the wagon coming. Deep in the lowest valley, the creek was running in the shadow of the dirt bluffs. When Laura looked up those bluffs, she couldn't see the prairie grass at all. Trees grew up the bluffs where the earth had crumbled, and where the bare dirt was so steep the trees couldn't grow on it. Bushes held desperately with their roots. Half-naked roots were high above Laura's head. "Where are the Indian camps?" Laura asked Pa. He had seen the Indians' deserted camps here among the bluffs, but he was too busy to show her now. He must get the rocks to build the fireplace. "You girls can play," he said, "but don't go out of my sight, and don't go into the water. And don't play with snakes. Some of the snakes down here are poisonous." So Laura and Mary played by the creek, while Pa dug the rocks he wanted and loaded them into the wagon. They watched the long-legged water bugs skate over the glassy still ponds. They ran along the bank to scare the frogs and laughed when the green-coated frogs with their white vests plopped into the water. They listened to the wood pigeons call among the trees and the brown thrush singing. They saw the little minnows, that's little baby fish, swimming all together in the shallow places where the creek ran sparkling. The minnows were thin gray shadows in the rippling water. Only now and then one minnow flashed the sunshine from its silvery belly. There was no wind along the creek. The air was still and drowsy. It smelled of damp roots and mud, and it was full of the sound of rustling leaves and of water running. In the muddy places where the deer tracks were thick and every hoof print held water, swarms of mosquitoes rose up with a keen, sharp buzzing. Laura and Mary slapped the mosquitoes on their face and their necks and hands and legs and wished they could go wading. They were so hot and the water looked so cool. Laura was sure that it would do no harm just to dip one foot in. And when Pa's back was turned, she almost did it. "Laura," said Pa, and she snatched her naughty foot back. "If you girls want to go wading," Pa said, "you can do it in that shallow place. Don't go over your ankles." Mary waited only a little while. She said the gravel hurt her feet, and she sat on a log and patiently slapped at mosquitoes. But Laura slapped and kept on wading. When she stepped, the gravel hurt her feet. When she stood still, the tiny minnows swarmed around her toes and nibbled them with their tiny mouths. It was a funny, squiggly feeling. Laura tried and tried to catch a minnow, but she only got the hem of her dress wet. And this is what the girls looked like. Which one do you think you would be? If you were Laura or Mary, would you be sitting on the log watching, or would you be in the water? When the wagon was loaded, Pa called, "Come along, girls," and they climbed to the wagon seat again and rode away from the creek. Up through the woods and hills they rode again to the high prairie, where the winds were always blowing, and the grasses seemed to sing and whisper and laugh. They had had a wonderful time in the creek bottoms, but Laura liked the high prairie best. The prairie was so wide and sweet and clean. That afternoon, Ma sat sewing in the shade of the house, and baby Carrie played on the quilt beside her while Laura and Mary watched Pa build the fireplace. First, he mixed clay, that's a type of dirt, and water to a beautiful thick mud in the Mustang's water bucket. He let Laura stir the mud while he laid a row of rocks around 3 sides of the space he had cleared by the house wall. Then, with a wooden paddle, he spread the mud over the rocks. In the mud, he laid another row of rocks and plastered them over the top and down the inside with more mud. He made a box on the ground. 3 sides of the box were made of rocks and mud, and the other side was the log wall of the house. With rocks and mud and more rocks and more mud, he built the wall as high as Laura's chin. Then on the walls, close against the house, he laid a log. He plastered the log all over with mud. That means he covered it. After that, he built up rocks and mud on top of that log. He was making the chimney now, and he made it smaller and smaller as it went up. He had to go to the creek for more rocks. Laura and Mary could not go again because Ma said the damp air might give them a fever. Mary sat beside Ma and sewed another block on her 9-patch quilt, but Laura mixed another bucket full of mud. Next day, Pa built the chimney as high as the house wall. He stood and looked at it. He ran his fingers through his hair. "You look like a wild man, Charles," Ma said. "Your hair's standing all on end." "It stands on end anyway, Carolyn," Pa answered. When I was courting you, it never would lie down, no matter how much I slicked it with bear grease." He threw himself down on the grass at her feet. "I'm plumb tuckered out, lifting rocks up there." "You've done well to build that chimney up so high by yourself," Ma said. She ran her hand through his hair, and it stood up more than ever. "Why don't you make a stick and dab the rest of the way?" she asked him. So see what it looks like? There's Pa tuckered out in that nice looking chimney, firebox and chimney. "Well, it would be easier," he admitted. "I'm blamed if I don't believe I'll do it. I will." He jumped up. Ma said, "Oh, stay here in the shade and rest a while." But he shook his head. "No use lazing around here while there's work to be done, Carolyn. The sooner I get the fireplace done, the sooner you can do your cooking inside out of the wind." He hauled saplings, that's little small trees, from the woods, and he cut and notched them and laid them up like the walls of the house, on top of the stone chimney. As he laid them, he plastered them well with mud, so they were really covered with mud. And that finished the chimney. Then he went into the house, and with his saw, he cut a hole in the wall. He cut away the logs that made the fourth wall at the bottom of the chimney. And there was the fireplace. It was large enough for Laura and Mary and baby Carrie to sit in. Its bottom was the ground that Pa had cleared of grass, and its front was the space where Pa had cut away on the logs. Across the top of that space was the log that Pa had plastered all over with mud. On each side, Pa pegged a thick slab of green oak, that means it hadn't dried out yet, against the cut ends of the logs. Then, by the upper corners of the fireplace, he pegged chunks of oak to the wall, and on these he laid an oak slab and pressed it firmly. That was a mantel shelf. As soon as it was done, Ma set in the middle of the mantel shelf the little China woman she had brought from the big woods. The little China woman had come all this way and had not been broken. She stood on the mantel with her little China shoes and her wide China skirts and her tight China bodice and her pink cheeks and blue eyes and golden hair, all made of China. Then Pa and Ma, Mary and Laura, stood and they admired the fireplace. Only Carrie did not care about it. She pointed to the little China woman and yelled when Mary and Laura told her that no one but Ma could touch it. Oh, here they are. China is a kind of like a glass, so of course you couldn't give it to the baby to hold because the baby might throw it or drop it. What a nice looking fireplace. As soon as it was done, oh, let's see, I read that already. "You'll have to be careful with your fire," Carolyn Pa said. "You don't want sparks to go going up the chimney to set the roof on fire. That cloth would burn easily. I'll split out some clapboard as soon as I can and make a roof you won't have to worry about." So Ma carefully built a little fire in the new fireplace, and she roasted a prairie hen for supper, and that evening they ate in the house. They sat at table by the western window. Pa had quickly made the table of 2 slabs of oak. One end of the slab stuck in a crack of the wall, and the other end rested on the short, upright logs. Pa had smoothed the slabs with his axe, and the table was very nice when Ma spread a cloth on it. The chairs were chunks of big logs. The floor was the earth that Ma had swept clean with her willow bough broom. On the floor in the corners, the beds were neat under their patchwork quilts. The rays of the setting sun came through the window and filled the house with a golden light. Outside and far away to the pink edge of the sky, the wind went blowing and the wild grasses waved. Inside, the house was pleasant. The good roast chicken was juicy in Laura's mouth. Her hands and face were washed and her hair was combed. Her napkin was tied around her neck. She sat up straight on the round end of the log and used her knife and fork nicely, as Ma had taught her. She must not say anything because children must not speak at a table until they were spoken to. But she looked at Pa and Ma and Mary and baby Carrie in Ma's lap, and she felt contented. It was nice to be living in a house again. Wow. Now it's not like camping out anymore like it had been when you had to build the fire outside and cook outside. All right, well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I hope you're enjoying this story. And I think it's really interesting to learn how they made their house and made it into a special home. I hope you enjoy it too. All right, I want to pray blessings on you and yours in your house and out of your house, in the day and in the night. And whatever you do, keep dreaming. Keep a story in your heart. Good night.